Now let's talk about the type 1 and type 2 errors. When we are doing statistics, we need to take into consideration these errors because in real life, it's quite rare to always be accurate with our computations, or sometimes we're only dealing with sample sizes as an estimate for the population size or population statistic in general. And so we need to give allowance for these errors in our computation. There are two types of errors. Number one is type 1 error. Type 1 error are false positive. It is committed by rejecting a true null hypothesis. With this, the null hypothesis is true, but the business researcher decides it's not. On the other hand, the second type is the type 2 error or false negative. It is committed by failing to reject a false null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is false to begin with. The probability of committing a type 2 error is beta. And in type 1 error, it is symbolized by alpha, and type 2 error is symbolized by beta. So if you notice that in our earlier discussion with statistical inferences, we already included alpha in our computation when we use the t-distribution table. The differences between a type 1 and type 2 error can be better explained through this illustration. So in this illustration, we have two major parts. We have the true state of nature and we have decision. Under the true state of nature, we have the null hypothesis is true and the null hypothesis is false. And in the decision here, or the decisions, would be either to reject or to accept. So let's say that the true state of nature is that the null hypothesis is true. When you decide to reject what is supposedly a true null hypothesis, you committed a type 1 error. But then if you decided to accept this true null hypothesis, then that is a correct decision. Now let's say the true state of nature is that the null hypothesis is actually false. And so when you decide to reject this false null hypothesis, then you made the correct decision. However, if you accepted what was supposedly a false null hypothesis, then that is a type 2 error. So let's say, for example, this illustration about being pregnant and not pregnant. So we have here different values on the sides. Y is equal to 0 and y is equal to 1 for the different rows. And we also have y hat is equal to 0, which means negative, and y hat is equal to 1, which means it's positive. So y is the actual value and y hat may be the diagnosis in terms of this example. In statistics, y hat is the predicted value of y. So let's say that the true null hypothesis, or y is equal to 0, is that the person is not pregnant. And the diagnosis is negative, meaning it is a true negative that the person is really not pregnant. So the hypothesis that is not pregnant is accepted. Now let's say that the same also, that the person's true state of nature is not pregnant, but then the doctor decided to diagnose otherwise and say that there's a positive result that the person is pregnant. So that is a type 1 error in a way that it rejected the true null hypothesis. Now let us say that the person is actually pregnant. So y is equal to 1 means pregnant. And the diagnosis came in that it is a negative. So the doctor would say that the person is not actually pregnant. For the last intersection between y is equal to 1 and y hat is equal to 1, it is a true positive because the person is actually pregnant and the diagnosis is that it's positive, meaning that the person is really actually pregnant. So you see here the difference between a type 1 error and a type 2 error. And you could also kind of notice how the implications or the consequences would be between these two errors. In type 1 error, the person is not pregnant, but he is diagnosed as pregnant. Another example between the differences is, for example, the person is walking past a house and noticed that smoke is coming out of the house. So what the person actually doesn't know is that someone is cooking inside the house, or maybe grilling barbecue that's causing a lot of smoke. But then, since the person rejected the true null hypothesis that the house is not actually burning, that person might start calling the ambulance. Like, sure, the calling of the ambulance may stir some panic, or might even be embarrassing upon the thought that it's not, the house is not really burning, but at least it was the safest action to be done. Like, it's better to be safe than sorry, because the person actually called an ambulance upon the thought of a burning house because of the smoke. So for me, in my own definition, a type 1 error, or a person committing type 1 error, is borderlining between paranoid and being proactive about it. So there's nothing really absolutely wrong about it. I think it's safer than the type 2 error. For the same example of a house burning, let's say the house is actually burning. When you commit a type 2 error, instead of calling the ambulance, you accepted the null hypothesis that is the house is not burning, and so you decided to not call the ambulance regarding the situation. So in type 1 error, you call the ambulance despite no burning, but then in type 2 error, you did not call the ambulance despite the burning happening. So you could see there the implication, the consequences between these two errors, and you'll notice how more aggravating these consequences are with type 2 error. Here are other examples between the type 1 and type 2 errors. So type 2 error, go climb that mountain with sketchy gear, you won't die. With type 1 error, you'll definitely die if you go. So with type 2 error, it's encouraging you to go, even with all the sketchy gears that you have, promising you that you won't die. But what happens if that sketchy gear fails you when you're already atop the mountain, or maybe rock climbing, right? But in type 2 error, like I said, it's more paranoid, borderlining paranoid and proactive. And so you decide not to go at all because you think that you might die if you go mountain climbing. Well, you missed out the fun of going mountain climbing, but at least you're safe in your house. Another example, type 1 error, you dated the wrong guy. And type 2 error, you break up with someone you should hold on to. With this one, I think it's rather subjective. But for me personally, I think type 2 error is being with the wrong guy. And if you're married, then you're maybe stuck with the wrong person. And let's say the person is really aggressive, and then that's more aggravating. And for me, type 1 error is when you break up with someone you should hold on to because of fear that maybe the person is the wrong guy. So at least you're safer on your own. Lonely, but safer. So it's for this one, it's pretty subjective. It really depends on how you see it. But you get the point. In type 1 error, what you need to understand, what you need to know is that you rejected the true null hypothesis because you're kind of a paranoid, or you're just simply proactive. While in type 2 error, you accepted what was supposedly a false null hypothesis. Maybe because you're a bit careless, or you just don't care at all. So that's it.